Hello and welcome back to proving you're better than your friends by telling them about some insignificant detail from the books that was left out of the movies. Today we're taking a look at some of the differences between the Harry Potter books and the Harry Potter movies, specifically how the characters changed. I'm going to be giving them each a ranking from 1 to 5, 1 being a faithful adaptation, roughly, from the books, and 5 being essentially a completely different character, and then everything in between. Now, just a little bit of a note, I don't have every single character in here. If I did, this video would be 6 hours long, but I think I've hit most of the major ones, so if I didn't get yours, feel free to let me know about some difference that I forgot about in the comments. I'm sure there are plenty coming, but let me know below. As we kick things off, do me a quick little favor, like the video, click the subscribe button, leave a comment, say hello in the comments down below, and I'll say hello back. All of those things really help the video do well. I read a comment on a previous video that was talking about how I talk about the comments too often, and that annoyed me, so I promise you, I do read these comments, so keep them coming. I know you don't all agree with me, but keep the comments coming. I enjoy that part of this. So without further ado, let's jump in. Madame Pomfrey. Have you ever thought about the fact that Hogwarts students only have one nurse that they can go to? Well, that brings me to today's sponsor, ZocDoc. I'm in my 30s, and up until last month, I hadn't been to the doctor in 5 years. Honestly, having to find a new doctor is what kept me from going for so long. Booking a doctor's appointment is literally the last thing I want to do with my free time. But finding a new doctor or finding your first doctor in a long time doesn't have to be a nightmare. ZocDoc lets you search and compare local in-network doctors with detailed doctor profiles and real reviews from real patients. Something that should just obviously be possible in 2026. You don't even have to get on the phone with anyone. Booking appointments can happen directly on their site and can often be within 24 to 72 hours, sometimes even the same day. Trust me, there is nothing more annoying than finally mustering the energy to go to the doctor, only to discover there's no openings for months. Don't keep your health on hold like I did. Prioritize your health and get started today by clicking the link in the description or going to ZocDoc.com/vault. That's ZocDoc.com/vault. ZocDoc.com/vault. Thanks again to ZocDoc for sponsoring today's video. Dumbledore. I actually went back and forth quite a bit about where to start this list, but ultimately I decided that because of all the changes that happened outside of the actual character development within Dumbledore, that he just had to go first. The fact that not only were there obviously different directors, but that Dumbledore's actors switched halfway through the series, not even, meant that I kind of just had to start with him because he encapsulated so much of what I think went wrong with the movie adaptations. I specifically remember being absolutely devastated as a kid when Richard Harris died, and I was under the impression that Harry Potter would be canceled. There couldn't possibly be a way to find a different actor that could play Dumbledore. Lo and behold, we found another one. But I think that's kind of evident when you watch or binge through the series that there have been 2 different actors for Dumbledore and 4 different directors over the course of 8 movies. He's supposed to be a super powerful wizard that doesn't necessarily always have to prove it, and I don't think that necessarily comes through in either of the renditions of Dumbledore. And I mean, honestly, there's not a better place to start this than with the Dumbledore calmly asking Harry bit that happens in the Goblet of Fire. Obviously, when it's in the books, it's written calmly, and then we have Dumbledore racing over and strangling Harry, asking him if he actually did this in the movies. And I mean, I'm talking about this one because it's a bit of a gag and a goof within this, but I do think it ends up being kind of emblematic of the rest of Dumbledore's character throughout the movies. I mean, even when you go back and watch the scene where the goblet spits out an extra name, Dumbledore grabs it out of the air and he's looking around as though he's never seen or heard of Harry Potter in his life. I'm sure someone had to give him direction, aka the director, and I'm sure Michael Gambon? Obviously an accomplished actor, but the direction, I'm not quite sure what they were going for there, but maybe this is one of those examples of the director didn't read the book and therefore no one knew what the direction was. But I think it is the clear first difference between book Dumbledore and movie Dumbledore. Book Dumbledore doesn't fly off the handle and freak out at pretty much anything within the whole series. Movie Dumbledore is like on a razor's edge the whole time, and he might just snap if you look at him the wrong way. And I'm saying that, but that's kind of only true for like the latter 2/3 of the series, because Richard Harris's Dumbledore in movie 1 and 2 is kind of giving like very old grandpa, wise but not that powerful and kind of frail vibes, which he kind of was. No shade against him, but he was quite old when he was playing Dumbledore, and that kind of comes through. Even if Dumbledore's supposed to be 150 years old, he's still spry and he's still one of the most powerful wizards in the wizarding universe, so he shouldn't come across as someone who's about to fall asleep. Right? And honestly, I don't know if it all just happens at the same time because of the director switching, but when we go from Richard Harris to Michael Gambon, I think there is also some writing stylistic changes that happen, because it's around book 3 and book 4 and book 5, I guess, where magic becomes a lot less whimsical within the story. It's no longer about the cool effects that happen, it's more about throwing firecrackers at one another. And I think Dumbledore is someone that just kind of proliferates that throughout the screen time that he has. He goes from someone that has wisdom and reason to share it with Harry to someone that's just kind of an angry old grumpy wizard that, can't keep his emotions in check. And speaking of his emotional response getting completely flattened and lobotomized, he also does not have any semblance of a backstory in the movies. This is going to be a running theme throughout the whole video. Obviously, the movies have limited time. They can't do everything. But I still think certain things maybe shouldn't have been skipped. For instance, the entirety of Dumbledore's backstory, the fact that he has history coming to terms with what power means and what he wants out of life. The trauma that he's experienced that has led him down a path where he does have different expectations of Harry and wants him to be different. Every bit of backstory about his sister that accidentally died in a duel. There's a very, very brief moment with his brother Aberforth in the maybe Deathly Hallows Part 1. It's probably Deathly Hallows Part 2 now that I think about it. But it really doesn't go into any detail. It's not really relevant to anything. Dumbledore's already gone. It doesn't help with anything. And I think that matters because it describes and provides reason for why Dumbledore is not a power-obsessed wizard, and in fact is fighting against that, because he went through that with Grindelwald and came to the conclusion that that wasn't the path he wanted to go down. So without the backstory, we're just left without any real understanding of why Dumbledore acts in the way that he does, except for being a quote-unquote good guy. And so not only does he have no emotional regulation within the story, no backstory for his current story, he also doesn't really seem to have much of a relationship with Harry through most of the movies. There's especially moments where there are very emotional conversations and interactions that Dumbledore has with Harry's that are just missing. One such example is when Harry, at the end of Order of the Phoenix, comes in, freaks out, trashes Dumbledore's office. It's just not part of the movies, even though it's Harry at his wit's end. He is about to give up on everything, and we just don't get it for some reason. There's no part in the movie that shows the culmination of everything that Dumbledore has put Harry through for the last year of his existence, not to mention Sirius's death and everything else that came with it. And so, as someone that's supposed to be Harry's mentor throughout most of the story, it's kind of frustrating when we lose so many impactful moments that would have been great to see. And this is one of the many times that I'm going to say throughout this video that I'm hopeful, at least, that by the time the TV series, if it ever makes it to the 5th year, by the time it comes around, hopefully we get some of these more in-depth scenes and conversations between all of the characters, Harry and Dumbledore included. And speaking of scenes that I hope we get to at some point in the not too nearby future, is Dumbledore's funeral. It's like this moment where every magical creature in the nearby forest and realm comes to pay homage to Dumbledore, and we have mermaids there, we have centaurs there, like the phoenix fox is flying around, like, and instead we get this scene where all the students and professors just kind of gather outside and shoot a spell into the air, which is not coordinated. So I'm glad that all the students knew what they were doing and the first years didn't like light someone on fire by accident. But, you know, I understand sometimes why movies made changes. Like, it would have been a strange thing to either open the next movie with Dumbledore's funeral or close that one with Dumbledore. Like, it would have been weird. And so I understand why the shift was made, but it doesn't change the fact that I wish it wouldn't have been made. And I wish there was a way to do it that didn't detract from the overall movie and the pacing. And, you know, it still has to go to the theaters, and I understand the limitations. But I do also think probably, like, if the mer people were shown coming out of the water to sing, it would have been a little bit like that weird choir scene where I think Flitwick is the choir teacher all of a sudden, or maybe it's just the same actor. But the weird choir scenes that happen in one of the movies, I can't remember which one, but I do think the mermaid singing probably would have been a little bit cringe, but who am I to say? So all in, I think Dumbledore has this mix of things wrong with his character in the movies. He has a completely different emotional temperament to the books. He has absolutely no backstory. He has absolutely, I won't say absolutely none, but his relationship with Harry is diminished and there's just less of it shown. And there's also, on top of that, so many deleted scenes and pieces of the story that we just don't see in the movies, which is going to be the case for everybody, but some of them seem to be very important for Dumbledore, and I'm annoyed that they're not in the movies. So overall, I think I have to start off quite strong and give Dumbledore a 5 out of 5 ranking here as someone who is a completely different character. I mean, when the new HBO series comes out in a matter of months, all of a sudden we're going to have 4 different Dumbledores across different timelines, 5 different directors. It's just like very clearly there's never going to be consistency with this character, and that might be just something we have to come to terms with. Voldemort. Book Voldemort is terrifying because you understand there was humanity in him at some point in time, and he's been shifted into this monster. Movie Voldemort is terrifying because he's bald, he doesn't have a nose, and Ralph Fiennes says Avada Kedavra in a funny way. Those are 2 very different kinds of scary. And I'm sorry to all my hairline challenged watchers out there. I think I'm going to start Voldemort kind of in the same place that I went with Dumbledore, in that we are missing almost the entirety of Voldemort's backstory. We see snippets of him as a small child, but any sort of elaboration around his mom and her drugging her father and that whole story, like, none of it is really that explicitly laid out, even though it's foundational to Voldemort's character. His self-loathing, the idea that he has to deal with the fact that he is also not a pureblood wizard. All of his ideology is compensating for the shortcomings of his lineage and his backstory and everything like that. And we don't have none of it in the movies. And so while it doesn't necessarily exactly move the plot forward, and so I understand why it might have been cut from the movies, I think it's rather important for Voldemort's character to show where he came from. And that, you know, maybe is the case for most characters, but I think more than others, certain characters like Voldemort and Dumbledore really benefit from that. Case in point, when you don't have a backstory for Voldemort, it kind of removes all the parallels that go between him and Harry and the interplay between them being foils of each other. I mean, like, if you just watch the movies, you would have next to no idea why Harry and Voldemort's relationship is even all that special to begin with. I think probably if you just watch the movies, Voldemort's kind of just like a bad guy. TM, trademark. He's just a bad guy. There's nothing else to it. And so while we don't have his actual historical family background, the other thing we don't have is the background of any of his Horcruxes. And I think this kind of turns the whole last section of the movies, not so much the books, but the movies into this MacGuffin hunt where the trio is just running around looking for artifacts that if you're, a movie viewer, you probably are like, what is even happening right now? Why are we doing this? The fact that we don't have any history about how they were made or which murders took place to make which Horcruxes, I just think there's not enough weight placed on them for it to connect to Voldemort's motivations or make any sense as the watcher why these things are really all that important to begin with, or why they're hidden in plain sight. There's not so much explanation around these to the point that I think you're probably mostly just confused if you're only watching the movies. And so we're left with this Horcrux hunt that you can kind of piece together matters for Voldemort's death. And death is the next topic that I want to talk about for Voldemort. There's two main ones to talk about. So first, we'll talk about Quirrell and Quirrell's death, I guess. Voldemort's not dying there, but Quirrell's death and how that is different between the movies and the books. Because in the books, Voldemort just kind of abandons Quirrell's body at some point. Whereas in the film and the movie version, Harry kills Quirrell very deliberately. Maybe he's passed out by that time, but he murders him in the movies. So it turns, instead of Voldemort's sort of callousness and lack of any care for any of the well-being of his followers, into Harry being the agent of death, and Voldemort is forced out of the body because of that. I don't blame them for making changes like that, but it does have implications because I just don't necessarily, first of all, think that's the path that most 11-year-olds would take, turning into Murder Hands McGee and melting Quirrell's face. Because in the books, Harry grabs Quirrell as sort of a last resort. He just instinctually reaches out to try to stop it. He's not purposely, the movies, he looks down at his hands and he's like, oh, I can do something with these. And then he sprints and grabs Quirrell's face. That is very different than the sort of self-defense technique that we see in the books. And while I think this change is pretty subtle and it maybe doesn't matter too much, let me maybe look at one other example of death and see if that rings a little bit more true. It's, of course, the final death. And instead of the books, where Voldemort crumples and falls to the ground like a normal human being, you all remember how the movies end. He gets Thanos snapped into dust and just kind of fades away after his spell backfires. And obviously that is an important change because the whole point is that Voldemort is just a human being and he should just be treated as a normal man at the end instead of crumpling to dust. But the other changes that also happen, which I do think are important, are the fact that in the books, everyone is present in this final duel. Whereas in the movies, we get this scene where Harry and Voldemort fly around the castle and break through the roof, and somehow damage doesn't matter at that point, but they're flying through huge pieces of lumber and timber in the castle, and that doesn't hurt them apparently, but then they just tumble at 60 miles an hour into the courtyard, and then it's just a battle with the two of them. And I don't think that's quite as impactful, not only for the viewers, but also for the other characters that have sacrificed and seen their comrades fall in battle. They're not there to witness the end. And small tangent, when Harry and Voldemort are sort of running around the castle in the movie version there, Voldemort's shooting a lot of green looking spells at Harry, and Harry's kind of blocking them. Are we to assume that he's not casting Avada Kedavra over and over again at him, and it's just a different green spell that Voldemort's casting at Harry? Because I don't know what possible reason Voldemort would have to not just cast Avada Kedavra every time he casts anything at Harry. And if we're to follow the logic of the story, it's an unblockable spell. So I don't really know what's going on in their little skirmish earlier on in the final climax. But I don't know, whatever, you guys tell me about that one. I think this shift for the end is really kind of annoying because not only does it turn into a 1v1 on Rust duel at the end there, it's also Harry doesn't do as much explaining and talking to Voldemort about what's happening. There's not as much exposition that happens in the movies. I think that kind of stuff is important at the very end to sort of tie up all the loose ends and, make the whole conclusion makes sense, but we don't get any of that in the movies. And one other question about that final battle scene, what spell does Molly cast to kill Bellatrix Lestrange? In the movies, she freezes her and then shatters her into a million pieces. In the books, there's just a sort of nondescript curse that hits Bellatrix. Are we to assume that Molly is casting Avada Kedavra also here? And like, we're all cool with that at this point? I mean, I don't blame her, but like, are we all just cool with that? Is that okay? I mean, I don't know. So I don't know. In the end, I mean, I think like that whole final scene with Voldemort's death and him turning to dust and no one else gets to see it, it matters. And in the books, it's like this thing where everyone can come and see that it is finished and they don't just have to take Harry's word for it. And also, if Voldemort just kind of like faded away into dust, I would almost be like, are we sure that's the end? Like, are we sure there's nothing else coming back after this? Instead of just having his body on the ground where you can be pretty sure that that's the end. The books, the death of Voldemort is personal and it's a human. And the movies, the death of Voldemort is a special effect. One other small thing that's a little bit out of order, but I just thought about it, is the way that the Death Eaters use magic within the story. Specifically the fact that they can all suddenly fly and that they all basically cast the same spells as Voldemort. I think that's kind of annoying because it a little bit undermines his power. You know, he's supposed to be the only one, him and Snape, I guess, that can fly without brooms. And instead, we got a whole bunch of both Death Eaters and Aurors, I think sometimes, just flying around. And I think it's important to show that there's levels of skill and power between Voldemort and his followers. Because otherwise, what's the point of him being the leader if they can all do the same magic? So if I have to wrap up Voldemort, I think there's a few things. A, obviously they removed all of his backstory and all of his reason for being who he is. So that's one point against him. But they also just seemed to make him more simple and generic. He goes from a psychopathic monster to kind of just a capital B, capital G bad guy, which I don't think is quite as compelling as a villain. And so for that reasons, despite the fact that, you know, he's still maybe just redeemed by Ralph Fiennes' performance, I am going to give Voldemort a 4 out of 5 for being basically a major rewrite of his character. I don't think it's quite a different character, but I will stick with 4 out of 5. It's a major rewrite. Ron. All right, I think the next few are really gonna get a few of you, so stick around. We're starting with Ron, and then we're moving on to Hermione right after this. I think that somewhere in the writer's room, Ron just became less of a loyal friend and a capable sidekick and just kind of got turned into pure comic relief. He's just a sort of bumbling idiot that's reduced to sarcastic Marvel quips instead of being an important character that helps Harry through the story. Now, I don't think this is a hot take. I think it's probably one thing that most people will agree with, that Ron is basically robbed of his entire character throughout the series. It starts kind of small, but it just kind of builds through the whole series. It's a little hard to write this section for Ron, because honestly, I think that basically Ron, Hermione, Neville, Dobby, a few others just kind of got put in a blender, mixed up, and then we popped out some mixture of them. And Ron just happened to be the redhead, and that's how we got him. But like, he's a little bit of a grab bag of random things in the movies. So if I had to start somewhere, I would say that the movies basically decided to emphasize over everything else comedy at the expense of the rest of any defining traits from the books that Ron had. He's not loyal, he's not capable, he doesn't seem to have any of the world knowledge that he does in the books. He basically just makes jokes. And this is hard because I don't entirely, I enjoy Ron's character in the movies and the books, but there could be more here. For instance, one place where this starts pretty early on in Chamber of Secrets, Hermione gets called a mudblood, and then we get this scene where Ron is describing what that means to her. And not only is Ron illuminating Hermione on the meaning of the word, but he's also obviously, explaining what it means to the reader. In the books, Hermione already knows this somehow, despite being completely new to the wizarding world. This is not a section about Hermione, so I'm going to cut it there, but the fact that this is just one of many examples that just steal Ron's line and give it to Hermione. I'm going to give you a couple more. Obviously, in the very first book, there's the Devil's Snare. And in the books, the trio falls through. Harry gets through. I don't know. They're all struggling. Hermione's like freaking out. She's like, I don't know how to start a fire. I can't start a fire. And Ron is the one that's calm and collected and tells her, like, you're a witch. Just use magic. You can do this. Whereas, cut to the movies, Harry and Hermione get through, and Ron is up there, like, scrambling like an idiot, despite the fact that that's nowhere to be seen in the books. And I wonder sometimes that if in the first book they hit on something with Ron that audiences responded well to, which was this comic relief thing, and that just meant that in every subsequent film, they just doubled down on it and tripled and quadrupled and quintupled down on this idea that Ron's just comic relief. Move forward a couple books, we end up in Prisoner of Azkaban. They're in the Shrieking Shack. Ron has just like broken his leg, in the books at least. I don't know if his leg is broken in the movies. Either way, Ron in the movies is like this scared, bumbling little fool on the ground, pointing to Sirius as this danger. And right there immediately, Hermione steps in front of Harry and says, you're going to have to kill all of us. In the books, that's Ron. Ron is the one that stands up and is brave and loyal, maybe living up to his Gryffindor claim, and yet none of that is present in the movies. I honestly think that Ron is at his bravest in this entire series when he sacrifices himself playing wizard chess. He's gonna sacrifice himself. No, you can't. You can't, Ron. Once I move, you'll be free to check the king. That whole thing. Honestly, when you go back and watch a couple scenes of Ron in Prisoner of Azkaban, he is like the whiniest, most terrified baby. Like, it's very annoying, honestly, because it's not what he is in the books. Then, of course, you rob him of any sort of loyalty for his friends. In book, actually, I think this is also Prisoner of Azkaban, because Snape is showing he's filling in for Lupin, and they're talking about werewolves. Hermione raises her hand, answers out of turn or whatever. Snape berates her and asks if she takes pride or joy in being an insufferable know-it-all. And in the books, Ron defends her. He calls out Snape, goes too far, gets punished for it. Whereas in the movies, Ron's like, yeah, you're right. She is. And the whole point of the scene in the books is to show camaraderie between the students against Snape. It says that they all have called Hermione an insufferable know-it-all. But the point is that Snape can't do it. Her friends can do it. So it's just a weird switch to make. It's not like he needed to do that. They didn't take that line from somebody else. It wasn't necessarily needed to move the plot forward. They just decided to make Ron agree with Snape for some reason in Prisoner of Azkaban. And it's a joke, but it starts to chip away at the idea of Ron's loyalty, which is a key part of his character. And so I think I would wager that if you were to ask a book and a film viewer and reader about their thoughts on Ron, I think you would have two very different reactions and explanations or descriptions of Ron from those two people. I think, honestly, that he's pretty much a different character between the two. And so for that reason, I think I'm going to give Ron a 5 out of 5. He's a different character. I think the cumulative effect of the films is that there's an entire generation of movie-only Harry Potter consumers that think Ron is just an idiot and just like the clown of the group, where in reality, he does have a balance of both humor and competence and loyalty and bravery and all the other things. He's just a much more complex character. I know you can say this for every single character on the list, but I do think Ron is explicitly bad. So we are going to give him a 5 out of 5. Hermione. Okay, so like I said, we're moving on directly to Hermione right after Ron. Ron lost his personality. Hermione didn't necessarily gain a different personality. She just got handed everyone else's personality, and somehow that makes her worse. So a quick recap of the differences here. that we just talked about, right? The Devil's Snare calmness that's like completely gone between the books and the movies. Hermione is not calm in the books. She is in the movies. The mudblood explanation. For some reason, this brand new witch to the world understands what a mudblood is, knows about it, gives the explanation herself for no reason. The Shrieking Shack incident where she jumps in and is the brave one that says she's going to have to be, you're going to have to go through her first before you get to Harry. With the additional part that she tells Lupin that she trusted him, which was originally a line from Harry. Harry's the one that feels betrayed because Harry's the one that's been working with Lupin all year long. So Hermione suddenly gets this scene where she's like, I trusted you. And it's like, why? You were just a student. Like, Harry was the one that was spending countless evenings training his Patronus against the Dementors with Lupin's help, and divulging the secrets about like hearing his parents screaming and basically hearing Voldemort in his head. It makes a lot of sense for Harry to say that he trusts Lupin or trusted Lupin. It doesn't make any sense for Hermione to say that because she doesn't have that kind of relationship with him. It just doesn't make any sense. And another one that I just totally blanked on until now, in Philosopher's Stone, when Ron levitates the Trolls Club up and drops it on the troll's head, in the books, Hermione is just cowering in a corner. She is like not incompetent. She's like whatever. She's not contributing to that battle there. Ron figures it out on his own. He kind of reacts, but he does just figure it out on his own. In the movies, you can't even give him that. And Hermione's under the sink, like swish and flick, Ron. And it's like, you can't even give him one little moment of just being, not a total idiot. Like, this is the Hermione section now, and she's still part of this, so I think it's fair game. I think what this builds toward is the fact that Hermione goes from what is a very flawed character to one that is essentially perfect. She doesn't have any nuance in the movie. She's basically brilliant. She solves every puzzle for them. She's brave. She's the one that always stands up in front to fight. There's just no flaws in her anymore in the movies, and that doesn't make a good character, because not only is it boring, it also means that there's no growth possible if you're already perfect. It also just kind of reduces the tension overall if you have a perfect genius with you all the time that can solve all your problems. There's no tension if you're like, oh, Hermione will figure it out, because she always does. There is a real difference between someone that's clever but fallible and someone that's brilliant and perfect. And I don't totally understand the reasoning of making Hermione completely flawless in the movies. Because speaking of that flawed potential and even like morally gray parts of Hermione's character, there are some that exist in the books that are just sort of erased in the movies, and I don't know why. For instance, the entire sort of subterfuge plot within Dumbledore's army, or the fact that Hermione is sort of trying to protect Dumbledore's army, and she has this whole plan that ends up jinxing the person that gives away Dumbledore's army. All of that is removed, and Cho Chang is the one that ends up spoiling everything, and she's under Veritaserum, I guess, but like, I don't know, there's just no reason to remove what would be a very small plot line. You wouldn't even need a known character to be the one that receives the hex from Hermione. It's more to show that Hermione is morally gray, but we don't get that. We just get Cho Chang and Umbridge and Veritaserum, and I guess it's the faster way to do it, but I don't know. Is fast necessary here in this instance? I don't know. And one last change that I thought is just worth bringing up, even if it's mainly just a small continuity error. There's this moment in Chamber of Secrets where Hermione gives the line that fear of a name, it only increases fear of the thing itself. That is originally a line from Dumbledore about Voldemort and saying Voldemort's name. Hermione is the one that says it in the movies for some reason, even though she continues to say you know who or he who must not be named for like another 4 books before it's a huge brave event that she says Voldemort's name. So I just don't understand why they would have chosen to give certain lines to Hermione in the first place, because they just don't even make any sense. And it's not like Dumbledore's a super minor side character that you're just trying to streamline here and there. So just get rid of that character or move some of the lines over. Like, obviously, Dumbledore's not a side character. There's no reason that Dumbledore can't deliver this line. Small things like that, they all sort of add up over time. And so I think to contrast Ron, who loses any sort of depth and it becomes just this comic relief character, Hermione just kind of inflates and gains, volume, I guess, but doesn't have any definition to her character. She's just a perfect character that gets everything right, doesn't have any downsides, and I just don't think that's interesting. So for that reason, I'm going to give Hermione a 4 out of 5. I think that she's less of a different character, quote unquote, than Ron is. She still has a lot of her core elements to her. They just became a little bit flat and a blend of everyone else's redeeming qualities at the same time. So I don't know. I'm curious in the comments. I'm giving Hermione a 4 out of 5. I gave Ron a 5 out of 5. Which do you think got the worst edits in the movies? Ron or Hermione? Or is it just that they're both tied and they both should have just stuck with their original characters more so? I don't know. Let me know in the comments which one you think got it worse off. I think it's Ron, but I'm sure you all have opinions about that. Harry. Sometimes I get about 45 minutes into recording and I have this panic moment where I think I haven't pressed record on something. There's no thing in the world like the dread of thinking that you've missed 45 minutes of recording. All right, Harry. Harry was kind of a hard one to write because obviously so many things change with Harry, but there's not always a simple theme to those changes. And so, I started this with just basically a big list of differences that happen between the books and movies for Harry. And I didn't get to a point until, most of the way through this. And I think my main idea here is that every change that happens to Harry points in a single direction. And it points towards just making him a more generic hero figure and a more likable character throughout the whole series. It removes any sort of emotional depth that he has, any sort of defining characteristics, his anger, his trauma, his cheekiness, the sarcastic nature he has. All of it's kind of smoothed off. I understand why it happens. It's a major blockbuster film, and maybe it's the fact that they had to have Harry appeal to everyone, and maybe there's also a component of Daniel Radcliffe's personality leaking into Harry in some way, but still at the end of the day, he doesn't have the depth in the movies that he does in the books. So let's start with maybe some of those emotional characteristics. I mean, in Order of the Phoenix, Harry's sometimes a challenge to be around. He is angry, he's mad, he's obviously been pretty much abandoned by Dumbledore, but he's not a fun person to be around all the time. And we kind of lose a lot of that. He's a lot calmer in the movies. He's more likable. He's basically pretty reasonable the whole time. And obviously the reason for all of this is to make him more likable and make him easier to root for as a movie audience, but you lose a lot when you do that. And I think some of the implications of that is that if you're a movie-only viewer, Harry comes off a lot more reserved in the movies than he does in the books. In the books, he is if a professor says something he doesn't like, he's got a quip loaded in his back pocket, even if it's Snape or even if it's Umbridge that means detention and scribbling marks, carving marks into the back of his hand. He's ready to bear it all for the bit if he wants to, and you don't really get much of that in the movies. And I think there's an argument that this kind of just makes him boring. He's not terrible, but I do think it kind of just makes him more boring in the movies than in the books. So if you're a fan that loved the books and then went to the movies, you probably noticed a sort of gap in his character and the boldness of his approach to life, I guess, within the movies. I didn't have a ton of specific examples for this because it's kind of just woven throughout the entire series, and it's hard to pinpoint individual ones. So I honestly am ascribing a lot of differences to the fact that Harry's emotional and his temperament basically is very different in the books than it is in the movies. I do have to say there's probably a few things where I do think they maybe improved upon Harry and the things happening around him. A couple takeaways. It's not exactly Harry, but Hedwig's death, I think, in the movies is better than in the books. Like, this isn't Harry's character at all, but it's as close as I get to Hedwig, and I don't have a section for Hedwig, unfortunately. Hedwig sacrifices herself in a very real way for Harry during the Battle of Seven Potters, versus in the books, she's just in a cage and dies. And I think that is truly an improvement on the books to the movies. Another thing that I think they improved on is the way that Harry handles the Elder Wand at the end of the series. In the books, Harry returns the wand to Dumbledore's tomb and it just goes there. Where in the movies, he snaps it in half and throws it off the edge of the bridge. To me, Harry's approach in the books just simply doesn't make any sense, because immediately after all of this happens, Harry then goes on to a career with the Aurors, where he becomes someone that runs around and duels people for a living. So the fact that he takes this extremely temperamental wand, one that switches allegiance every time the owner loses, and just places it in a spot that is, honestly, quite predictable, I think that's a flawed plan, especially after he's gone through the sort of intricacies of that allegiance for the Elder Wand and understands it quite well. The fact that he just kind of forgets about all that and then just puts it in a spot where just about anyone could access it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. And so in the movies, when he snaps it, I think that's a more satisfying and logical conclusion to that story arc. Lastly, there are a few things that I think probably just don't matter all that much, but I thought I would list them just because I thought they were interesting or weird. Like, for instance, the fact that his happy memory for his Patronus changes from the books to the movies. It goes from learning that he's a wizard and learning that he can leave the Dursleys and go to Hogwarts, and that's his happiest memory in the books. And in the films, it's just this sort of vague memory about his parents. And I kind of understand why this happens. The Dursleys are not front and center in the movies in the same way that they're kind of always at the edge of Harry's thoughts in the books. But people know who the Dursleys are. They didn't need to make that swap. I don't totally understand why that was necessary. Obviously, another small change that doesn't really matter is the fact that Harry's eye color in the movies is not green, and it's because Daniel Radcliffe couldn't wear the contact lenses without it bugging his eyes. So I don't know. I'm just going to mention it because someone's going to mention it in the comments, and I don't know. I kind of think whatever about that, honestly. But that's not everybody. The last kind of, I don't know what to do about it change is the fact that Harry uses magic at the Dursleys' house and doesn't get exposed or caught for using it underage when it's really not too long after it's just happened the previous year. He uses Lumos, I think, under his bed sheets or something to look at a letter or something like that. I just don't know how this would slip past quality assurance in the first place. How would no one be like, hey, I don't think he can do magic here. I don't think he's allowed to do that. To sum up, none of these individual changes make a huge difference to Harry, but when you put them all together, you end up with this character that is just engineered to be more likable. His angry teen angst gets sort of plastered over, and he's just, kind of disagreeable sometimes. His quips get almost entirely removed, which just makes him not funny anymore. And overall, I think realistically, he's just kind of a worse character, but he's just changed in a way to be more mass market appreciable. So I'm going to give Harry a 4 out of 5. I think it's probably on the verge. I'm sure people could make an argument for it being a 5 out of 5, but so much of his story is still there that I just can't quite justify giving him a full 5. I just think they took away his temperament and they took away things that often made him a compelling character. And instead, they did a major rewrite and made him a likable action movie star. So, 4 out of 5. Ginny. Okay, without totally giving it away, I think Ginny is basically just a character that they forgot to write. I think probably out of all the characters on the list today, this one will probably have the most consensus among all of you watching. I think the long and short of it is that the adaptation of Ginny to the silver screen just didn't work. It is honestly one of the most awkward relationships I have ever seen in such a large-scale Hollywood production. And that might be down to Daniel Radcliffe and Bonnie Wright and their respective characters, but I don't necessarily even know what else to say about that relationship, but clearly it's not working. So I guess if I had to boil it down to one thing, it's that she just doesn't have a character in the movies. Ginny in the books is opinionated and snarky and sarcastic, and she's in many ways very similar to Harry. And in the movies, she's just basically silent. She doesn't have quips about anything. She doesn't make jokes at people's expense. She doesn't challenge Hermione in the same way that she often does in the books. Her relationship with Luna Lovegood is totally missing. She just has nothing in the movies. And this is very clearly a moment where the films wanted to streamline things to keep it simpler and reduce the number of threads going. But when one of the characters is the love interest of the main character, it feels like maybe that's one of the threads you shouldn't have deleted. And some of them just don't even seem necessary to have removed in the first place. The whole naming of Dumbledore's army and Ginny's role in it, it's just removed. And instead, I think, I was trying to find the clip, I think they just go to Hogsmeade, and I think Hermione has a sheet of paper that just says Dumbledore's army on it or something like that. It's yet another thing that's just given to Hermione for some reason, but it was very clearly a huge part of the discussion of the group and what to name themselves, and some of it's a joke and some of it's not, but they arrive at Dumbledore's army for a reason, and Ginny's role in that is just gone for no reason. Instead, we just end up with a montage of swish and flicks and practice and quick cuts of people trying new spells and everything. But we don't get any actual exposition about Dumbledore's army and what they're doing. I mean, there's a little bit. Harry does a speech at one point, but it's basically just a repeated speech about, yeah, Voldemort's back for real. Yeah, for real this time. Yep, for real. And that's it. We also just don't get to see much of Ginny and her Quidditch skills. I don't really care about Quidditch in this story at all, or in the movies at least, so it's, I think, kind of continuously out of place, so I'm not too bothered about the fact that Ginny's not shown in this light very much. We get a few scenes of her, but maybe there are some others that are more bothered by this, but I personally don't count it too much against her character. So we arrive at this place where Ginny is not a swap like Ron and Hermione. She's not this softened character like Harry is. She's just kind of deleted. And so I think because her character just doesn't exist in the movies, I have no choice but to give her a 5 out of 5. She is a different character in that she doesn't exist. I honestly don't even think this one's going to be controversial, so I don't know. You can let me know in the comments what other specific things you missed or didn't see or wished you had seen with Ginny's character in the movies. It's pretty much everything, but I don't know. I'm sure some of you have stronger opinions about Ginny than I do, but she's very obviously just completely missing from the movies. Snape. This is going to be another good one. I think if you ask anyone who's only seen the movies what they think about Snape, you'll probably hear he's a tragic character, he's misunderstood, he's, maybe he's secretly the hero of the story. And I think if you ask folks that stayed up till midnight to get their copy of the latest book from Barnes & Noble, I think they would have a very different view of Snape. And I think that kind of all starts with Alan Rickman's performance. He is, maybe more than any other character in the series, the person that when I think of Snape, I see, when I read lines that Snape has, I hear Alan Rickman's voice. He is Snape in my head, and probably many of yours. But I think that might actually be part of the problem. I think that maybe I'd argue that Alan Rickman actually kind of just rehabilitated Snape's character and his image in the books, from the books to the movies. He makes him a much more likable character, and not only just because he's like a more normal-looking human being than what's described by J.K. Rowling, but also just every characteristic about him is just nicer. And I think that's one of the huge differences. Among other things, movie Snape is never really shown as being cruel, at least not in the same way as book Snape. You don't necessarily get the sense from movie Snape that he would have let Voldemort murder James and Harry if it meant saving Lily. He's just kind of like an angsty, temperamental, strict teacher, and he provides kind of a check on Harry and his crew more than anything, but he's not someone that gives you the vibe that he would have let a child die. Another example of this, though, is the fact that Neville's boggart is Snape. In both the books and the movies, Neville's absolute worst fear, more than Voldemort, more than Dementors, more than whatever you want, his worst fear is Snape. And in the movies, I don't think there's like a lot that gives you a reason to understand that. It's almost treated more like comic relief because he's then turned into this clown figure, or he's dressed up in a dress or whatever when Neville does ridiculous. But in the books, there's a lot of times where Snape is just downright cruel to Neville. He berates him with basically every mistake he makes as like an 11-year-old. I'm pretty sure at one point he threatens to poison Neville's toad. I mean, he's just a terrible person to Neville, and very clearly Neville has like PTSD from dealing with Snape in a way that very clearly Snape should not be a professor. And to double down on that, there is the incident with Hermione's teeth, where Malfoy hits Hermione with a spell called like Den Sagwa or something like that, an incredibly specific spell for no reason within the series that just makes teeth grow. I'm going to make another video about ridiculous spells within the series because that's one of them. It's going to be on the list. So Malfoy hits Hermione with this spell that makes her teeth grow, and Snape intervenes, and he basically walks up and he says like, "Oh, I don't see any difference. Oh, your teeth look exactly the same, even though like they're triple the size that they normally are." It's such a terrible, like cruel moment for someone that very clearly has power over this student. He's like a 30-year-old man or like a 60-year-old man in the movies. It's very, very cruel. And that doesn't happen in the movies. So in the books, you get this character that is actually just a terrible person. In the movies, you get Alan Rickman occasionally being a little mean to Harry. And so if you go full circle and get to the sort of redemption side of Snape, it's a little bit different if you go from the books versus if you go from the movies. There's a couple different things that show Snape in a more protective light. For instance, in the movie version of Prisoner of Azkaban, Snape steps between Werewolf Lupin and the trio and is protecting the kids. In the books, he's unconscious. He does not help in that situation. So that's just one instance of rehabilitating his character a little bit. A second is a little bit of like rehabilitation by omission, wherein Snape's falling out with Lily is never really explained in the books. And specifically, even any of his interests in like the dark arts or like, the more genocidal side of his interests, none of that's really even talked about. It doesn't show him calling Lily a mudblood. So like none of the fallout really makes any sense. And honestly, I think the movie watchers never really have a compelling reason to think that Snape is a bad guy at all. The film basically frames him as a good guy at pretty much every turn. Like he's a sort of misunderstood and strict teacher, but he's not a bad guy. He's pretty much a good guy. Even if you go to his defining moment where he has told Voldemort the prophecy, Voldemort's going to go and kill the Potters. Like in the books, Snape goes and begs Dumbledore to save and protect Lily. He says he very explicitly does not care what happens to James and Harry. In the movies, he says save Lily, save them all, which is a fundamental change to the way that he believes in protecting the lives of others. And I don't know. I think that's something that's like actually quite important in a relatively big change to make. I think the films didn't so much rewrite Snape as much as they just kind of withheld all of the case against him. They kept all of the sort of sympathetic details or added them in the case of like the werewolf protection or his love for Lily and like being okay with hiding James and Harry, and they cut basically all of the cruelty out of his character. There's not a whole lot of examples of him being cruel to Hermione or Neville, or there's like, he's kind of a little petty with Harry sometimes, and like I think he smacks him with a newspaper or something a couple times, but like nothing all that bad. And so when you combine those two things, you're suddenly left with a very different Snape. Basically, at the end of the movies, if you only consumed the Harry Potter movies, it's not hard to believe that Snape was a good guy all along. In the books, he's a vile person. And so there is redemption in that he plays a role in stopping Voldemort, but he's not a good person. I had actually originally ranked him as a 4 out of 5 when I have my script in front of me, but I think I'm actually going to change it live to a 5 out of 5. I think he's a different character. I think he obviously should never have been allowed to be a teacher, but that's just book Snape. Book Snape should never have been allowed to be a teacher, but movie Snape just kind of hates his students a little bit. Book Snape is not a good guy. Movie Snape is basically just kind of a jerk. So I'm sticking with 5 out of 5 for Snape. Let me know what you think about that. Draco. Draco Malfoy is probably the best argument for the fact that a great performance can really do more for a character than the source material might ever be able to do. I think you need to acknowledge a few things about Draco, first of all. In the books, we really only see Draco through the eyes of Harry, his main nemesis. So everything we hear about Draco is biased and jaded. Harry is very obviously a flawed narrator. When you're in a movie and on camera, that bias and flawed narration doesn't exist by default. And that alone gives Draco's character a little bit more room to act naturally and flush out the details. I don't know if it's so much the movie or the writing that changed Draco's character as much as the medium changed the way that we see Draco and experience his character interact with everyone else. And I think, honestly, that the way that book Draco is described is honestly not that far off from the way that movie Draco is portrayed by Tom Felton. I mean, later books describe Draco as this like exhausted, skittish, scared, visibly like deteriorating character who's like succumbing to the weight of Voldemort's pressure on top of him. And that's kind of an interesting character. I mean, it's this like bully character who got exactly what he wanted, this proximity to power and the ability to sort of exercise power through that association with Voldemort, and he's falling apart because of it. I think Tom Felton plays this very well, and I think really the films just kind of give you a visual accompaniment of what the books already described. For instance, the whole Sectum Sempra scene where we run into Draco in the bathroom falling apart. He's poisoned Ron. He's put this hex on, what is her name? Katie Bell or whatever. He's in the bathroom falling apart. And Harry comes in to confront him, and they have this duel that takes place. It's worth noting here that in the books, Draco is about to cast Crucio on Harry. So he is about to, send off an unforgivable spell before Harry almost murders him with Sectum Sempra. But, that detail is cut from the movie. And so really you're left with this, Draco's kind of a victim in this scene, and Harry's just sort of an aggressor, which is a little bit of an interesting twist on it. I will also say, as a side note, it was interesting. I was going back to watch this scene. The latter few movies, 6 and 7, 7 part 1, 7 part 2, get so dull and washed out and gray and unsaturated. It's kind of incredible. It's kind of like the way that all movies were going around that time period, but when you watch it in hindsight, it is bizarre how like bland they are compared to like Philosopher's Stone and Chamber of Secrets. They're like visually kind of boring. I don't have a broader point about how that like mimics the whimsy of the magic or anything. I just think it's an interesting thing when you go back and watch it, but whatever. On to the next piece here. It's a small thing, but there's a scene in Deathly Hallows where they're at Malfoy Manor and Draco is asked to confirm that Harry is Harry, but he's been, disfigured by Hermione. In the books, like you don't obviously know how disfigured he is. In the movies, they show Draco like standing right next to Harry, and Harry is so obviously Harry Potter that it doesn't make any sense for Draco to be like, I don't know, I can't be sure. Obviously, this is like Draco's fear taking over. It's not so much that he's actually trying to protect Harry, but the fact that they even need Draco to identify Harry in the first place when he is like probably the most well-known face in the wizarding world, short of Dumbledore, is hilarious. Because it's like he has a swollen eye and that's kind of about it. So it just, I don't know. You have to go watch that scene and watch it back because it's crazy how recognizable Harry still is in that scene. I put Draco after Snape because I think they're kind of similar, at least in my framework here. I think Alan Rickman obviously did an incredible job with Snape. I think Tom Felton also did a pretty incredible job with Draco the whole way through. The main difference here is that there really wasn't all that much removed from Draco, and honestly, I think, maybe they smoothed out a few things, but overall, he's still a bratty rich kid that kind of disintegrates over the course of a few films. And for that reason, I'm going to have to give Draco a 1 out of 5. I think he's probably the first in my video that is a roughly faithful character adaptation from the books to the movies. People love Draco, or I think people love Tom Felton, but Tom Felton at this point has basically embraced being Draco forever, so they basically are the same thing at this point. But I think Draco deserves a 1 out of 5 faithful adaptation. Sirius. Book Sirius is this reckless, selfish person that treats Harry as a stand-in for his dead best friend, his father. He's explicitly not necessarily a great father figure here. Film Sirius is just kind of a sad, cool uncle who dies. I don't think there's a better place to start this than with the huge battle in the Department of Mysteries in Order of the Phoenix, where Sirius and Harry are dueling next to each other, which doesn't happen in the books. And then Sirius says, like, nice one, James, kind of out of the blue. It's like not a focal point, but he clearly calls Harry by his father's name. This is something that doesn't happen whatsoever in the books and is actually such a strange addition that it's worth talking about, because the books spend a lot of time pushing back on Sirius treating Harry as an extension of James rather than his own person. It's this thing that Molly confronts him about and is talking to him about, like, don't treat Harry like his father. He's his own person. Got to treat him like a kid, etc., etc. It's this continuous drumbeat. You know about it as a topic within the books. In the movies, that's never really brought up. It just is kind of introduced at the last second as Sirius mistakes Harry for James in his final moments. And I do honestly think it's a little bit hard to read as a movie viewer. I think there's plenty of people that read this nice one, James moment as like this uncritical kind of like endearing thing that Snape does to Harry, rather than legitimately confusing Harry for his dead father. But I think it's probably reasonably hotly debated topic within the community here. Because on one hand, you have the perspective that it basically is just proving Molly Weasley right, and that Sirius is just substituting Harry for his dad, his best friend, his dead best friend James. But on the other hand, you have the perspective that maybe Harry did need to be treated differently and without kid gloves because of his circumstances and because of everything that he's going through. I'm kind of the opinion that whether or not Sirius mixes up Harry's name in the heat of battle is kind of separate from the fact that he should or shouldn't treat Harry as a kid and maybe doesn't need the kid gloves for him. So I don't know. Like, it's kind of a weird thing to just throw in there at the very end. I do think that's true, but like, I'm also not too bent out of shape about it. So I don't know. You'll have to like let me know your thoughts about that one. It's not, I think, quite as important as some people want it to be. Another small change that happens right in that moment is obviously his death. The books are ambiguous. His death is caused by a specifically uncolored bolt of magic that hits him in the chest from Bellatrix. He gets hit, his eyes go wide, and then he falls through the veil. In the movies, Bellatrix casts a green spell at him, and obviously it's Avada Kedavra, and obviously it kills him. I think this is kind of an interesting thing because I'm sure this was a thing that was debated in the writing of the books of like, should we explicitly say that it's Avada Kedavra and then have him fall through the veil? Because that immediately removes any sort of ambiguity around what the veil actually is and what it does. When you see Avada Kedavra cast in the film, obviously Avada Kedavra kills him and then he just happens to float through the veil. But it doesn't leave you with this question of like, what if a random person just walked through the veil without any of the Avada Kedavra? Would that kill them? Would they just float away? Could they walk directly through? Like, what would happen there? That's a little bit related to Sirius and a little bit related to just the concept of death in the series overall. But I felt like he was the one that it most should be attributed to. I kind of prefer the ambiguous one because that's sort of the whole point of the veil, even if it's never explained after this. But I kind of like that ambiguity. The last thing to talk about with Sirius is his sort of emotional immaturity. I think this is yet again another example of a character falling by the wayside of the actor that's portraying him. I think Gary Oldman is just a little bit too suave for Sirius, especially when you compare Prisoner of Azkaban Sirius to like Order of the Phoenix Sirius. Like, Prisoner of Azkaban Sirius looks like his teeth are on the verge of falling out, and then Order of the Phoenix, he's like in a suit, in suede, and like his teeth look fine. Like, I guess you could fix that all with magic, but I don't know. They also don't seem to know what dentists are, so who knows how they fix these things. I do think that between Snape and Sirius, there are some issues that come to life when you have an actor portraying a character that is much younger than they are. Snape and Sirius, like, they're all supposed to be in their 30s or something, and all of these characters are being played by 50 or 60 or 70-year-olds. And that's not to say that that isn't possible, but I do think you lose a little bit of the energy potentially when you add in someone that's just much older to play this character. I understand sometimes why it happens with younger actors that just need more experience, but there's no reason you couldn't find an equivalent 30-year-old to play these characters. Like, sure, maybe you can't find a 10-year-old to play it well, but, you know, there's plenty of 30-year-olds that can play the character. Anyway, that was an enormous tangent, but, besides the appearance of these characters, Sirius is a deeply immature person. He's been locked away in Azkaban for like 12 years, so obviously he should not be able to just seamlessly reintegrate into society. He should be kind of scarred and not great at social interaction. And there are examples of this in the book that just don't make it into the movies. Like, in the books, when Sirius's head pops out of the fire to talk to Harry and Hermione about potentially visiting during their next trip to Hogsmeade, Harry and Hermione are immediately like, no, don't do that. You can't come. They're going to find you out. You can't do that. And Sirius is like bummed. And he's like, oh man, James would have loved how risky this was. And like, he's very clearly sort of guilt tripping Harry and sort of making it very clear that he just misses James and doesn't quite care as much about Harry. But B, he doesn't show any of the emotional maturity to understand that that's not a good idea. It's also incredibly manipulative to say that to Harry, who's impressionable and in peak teen angst form. Like, it's just a bad idea all around. I will also say, just as a weird side note, when you go back and watch some of these scenes, especially when Sirius's head is popping through the fire, in Goblet of Fire, there's this cool effect where Sirius's head is like made out of coals and he's basically emerging directly from the fireplace. In Goblet of Fire, it's like this weird, cheap hologram version of it. And I don't know why they like walked back what was very clearly a better version of the effect. I don't know if they just ran out of budget in Order of the Phoenix or what, but very clearly the speaking through the fire is a much better effect in Goblet of Fire than it is in Order of the Phoenix. So all in, the sort of warmth of Sirius's character is there. His death is obviously there, but you're missing all of the sort of mess and the friction that comes with his character. I think that overall, he's still quite recognizable as Sirius Black. I don't think that he's really, to the degree that he's unrecognizable. And so for that reason, I have to give Sirius a 3 out of 5. He's one that's noticeably changed, but I don't think it's quite as bad as some of the other characters and the treatment that the other characters get. So 3 out of 5, we'll keep it there. Lupin. Lupin is a character that I think, in large part, kind of survives the adaptation, but the problem is I think everything around him does not. And that leaves him as a sort of floating character without a lot of context or purpose. So starting with that context, the fact that the Marauders are never really explained. The backstory of Sirius and James and Pettigrew coming together to help Lupin in his time of need is all just deleted from the story. It's honestly quite confusing because Prisoner of Azkaban doesn't give you basically any details about the Marauders. They show you their names on the map, but it's never really explained. I think maybe they call each other by their code names at some point in there, but otherwise there's no explanation for any of it, which just is confusing. And I think that matters because it's sort of like the emotional foundation of Lupin's character. He is this ostracized person in society that no one likes and everyone pushes to the side because of his werewolf nature. And the fact that the Marauders, the only people that stood up for him and, tried to help him, just have no explanation, I think that takes something away from his character. This is the third or fourth time where context is just completely stripped away from a character, and it makes them worse. It makes them less believable. It makes them more confusing and less clear to follow their intentions than if you had just included a small little, deleted scene about the background. I think this is yet another example that's probably going to have sort of complete agreement from all of you that it's weird and annoying that the Marauders have no backstory in the movies as compared to the books. It's also a little strange because also in Prisoner of Azkaban, Harry is the one that tells Lupin he saw Peter Pettigrew on the map rather than Lupin discovering Peter Pettigrew in the climax of the story. And I think it's one of these moments where the sort of cultural zeitgeist of Harry Potter at the time ran faster than the movies, and they just basically wrote a movie for an audience that they thought already knew everything about what was about to happen. That may have been mostly true, but it's still kind of annoying and doesn't necessarily hold up over time, especially if you haven't read the books. If you haven't read the books, you're just kind of in the dark. Speaking of being in the dark, Lupin's entire underground spy werewolf arc is just removed, which is kind of a shame because I think it has the potential for maybe one of the more interesting things that could be shown that isn't necessarily explicitly laid out in the book. So fingers crossed, who knows, maybe there's a spin-off that could come out of this. I'm picturing, I'm getting very Star Wars Andor vibes coming out of it. But before I get too far ahead of myself, there's this whole moment where Lupin is asked by Dumbledore to go undercover with the werewolves to basically try to convince them to fight for Dumbledore and fight against Voldemort. And this whole backstory for Lupin, his reason for helping, is just completely removed. Lupin in the books is this deeply tragic figure that goes through this entire arc from being ostracized to being a professor to going back into hiding to finding reason to help through his work undercover to having a child to returning to dying. And you really don't get any of that in the movies. You just get kind of this happy-go-lucky, oops, sometimes I'm a werewolf character that just doesn't have any of the complexity. So for the reason that Lupin's backstory is completely omitted, despite the fact that it's rich and deserving of being explored, for the fact that his personality is basically replaced with this kind of golden retriever-esque person, for both of those reasons, I think I have to give Lupin a 4 out of 5. He's a major rewrite here, almost more so from omission in a lot of ways, but still, I think he's a 4 out of 5. He's up there. Neville. Book Neville is a slow improvement over the course of 7 years. Movie Neville is a binary idiot or save the day hero. And I think all of that starts in a very simple place with the prophecy. Maybe unexpected, but the prophecy, I think, is an important part of Neville's story. It's something that's completely omitted from the movies, like not even mentioned in the slightest. And I think that matters because I think having Neville be the potential other person in the prophecy sets him up as something more than just this comic relief bumbling idiot character that he is. Because there's no reason to develop him as a alternative to Harry, there's no reason to give his character growth. Or at the very least, it seems like they forgot to give his character growth until basically the very end of the series. Instead, he just kind of comes across as like an incompetent sidekick for most of it. Voldemort chose Harry ultimately because he was another half-blood and he saw himself in Harry. But the idea that Voldemort made a choice isn't in the movies whatsoever. And so, I think Neville's importance as a character doesn't really matter in the movies. I think omitting that chance of the prophecy being about him kind of removes some of Neville's reason for being in the story to begin with, especially if you already have Ron acting as the bumbling idiot character. Case in point, at the very beginning in Philosopher's Stone, Neville is supposed to be in detention with Harry when they go out into the Forbidden Forest, but Ron replaces Neville. Ron is supposed to be like in the Madame Pomfrey's medical room. What's the infirmary? Instead, he ends up taking Neville's place. And then speaking of other things that were removed, later on in Order of the Phoenix, the entire bit of Harry, Ron, and Hermione going to St. Mungo's and coming across Neville as he's visiting his parents with his grandma, all of that is removed. And you don't see any of Neville's backstory. This is a very common running theme here, is that there's just no backstory for any of these characters ever, unless you're Harry, maybe. Anyway, you don't see any of Neville's reason for wanting to make his parents proud, or like the reason why the Cruciatus Curse is so affecting to him, because it was Bellatrix's torture that did it to his parents. Like, you don't see any of that. In the movies, there's like a quick one-off line that Neville gives to Harry after a lesson with Dumbledore's army, but like that's about it. And I think that removes some of the purpose Neville has for being part of the group and fighting against Voldemort and Bellatrix and all the bad guys. I think you lose some of that. So I think with Neville, you end up with two main issues. First, you lose the sort of cosmic importance of the prophecy side of Neville, and then you also lose any sense of personal motivation that he has as a character. What's left is this sort of like sad kid that's not very good at magic, but like eventually gets hot at the end, and so he gets to like have an important role at the end, but like otherwise he just doesn't have a huge purpose for being in the movies to begin with, and so his whole arc is kind of missing. That said, I just can't quite let myself give him a super high ranking, so I am going to leave Neville at a 3 out of 5. I think there's obviously notable changes about his character, but I really don't think it's quite as bad as some of the others on the list. Luna. To me, the main difference with Luna is that the movies basically turn her into a space cadet. There's a lot that the movies, I think, transfer over basically 1-to-1 that are, I think, honestly, a pretty faithful adaptation of her character. I mean, even the actress that plays Luna explicitly got the part because she was so true to Luna. I mean, they chose her because she embodied the character. I guess maybe let's start with a few things that I think maybe they did get right with Luna in the movies. I think certainly some of the oddities they got right, but that's kind of easy. So the fact that she's reading a book upside down, the fact that she goes on about Nargles and all, like these things I think are important to her character, and I'm glad that they kept them in them, but the stakes are pretty low there because it's kind of, again, comic relief. I think at least they got some of that right. And to her credit, I think her name is Ivana Lynch, maybe. she does a fantastic job at playing this sort of whimsical character. But that said, there's a ton of stuff that gets lost with her character that is kind of just a bummer. I think first and foremost, and the most important of them all, is that she loses any sort of gumption that she has in the books. In the books, she'll make some insane claim about something, but she'll back it up, or she'll have opinions about it, or she'll explain it. She's coming at it from the perspective of like fully believing the stuff that she's talking about. And she does it in a way that's very defensive and not like, she doesn't roll over in the way that it often feels like she does in the movies. And so I think the movies strip away any sort of like self-empowerment that Luna has in the books. That is honestly, to me, the biggest change, hands down, to her character. After that, there's small little details that are changed that I think are still important and flesh out her character, and there's not always necessarily a good reason for them to have been omitted in the first place. But for instance, her bedroom ceiling not having a huge mural of her friends, an impactful moment. So I don't know why they decided not to do that. The whole house is painted. When they go to the Lovegood's house, it's got drawings all over the walls. I don't know why they just decided not to include Luna's ceiling. The fact that she doesn't quite do all of the Quidditch commentary in the movie, I think, is a miss, because that's an awesome moment for her. And I think lastly, like, her introduction to the crew is a little bit different in the books than it is in the movies. In the books, she meets everyone on the train, and then they get on the carriages, and finally she has a sort of one-on-one conversation with Harry about Thestrals and the fact that she can see them too. In the movie, it all just kind of happens at once with the group on the wagons, and they all just kind of get mixed together. I think a lot of those are pretty minor, and I don't honestly think they make such a huge difference to her character, so there's not too much emphasis to put on them. I think a lot of it for me just goes back to she turns into this sort of space cadet, whimsical, like floating character that many times is pretty accurate from book to movie, but there are moments where she does stand up for herself that I think are just missing from the film adaptation. So with that in mind, I think I have to give her a 2 out of 5. I think she's like pretty much there, but something is missing between the film and the books. And so for that reason, I'm sticking with a 2 out of 5. Barty Crouch Jr. / Moody. Barty Crouch Jr. in the films, I believe, just didn't go far enough. They just didn't make him a bad enough guy. Maybe this is because this is the first film where things truly started to get a little bit darker with the series and they just couldn't go all the way there with Barty Crouch Jr., but I think the film suffers a little bit because of that. In some ways, they changed quite a few things, and in others, there's quite a few things that are pretty consistent between the film and the books. One first thing that I might talk about would be like the ferret scene with Draco, where he turns Draco into a ferret. In the books, he turns Draco into a ferret and then he like slams him into the ground. There's a very descriptive scene with Moody like slamming Draco repeatedly into the stone ground, whereas in the films he just kind of like levitates him up and down and then he lets him go. And I think this is important for 2 reasons. One, you lose the sort of like meanness that Barty Crouch Jr. has in this moment. And you also, 2, miss this sort of as a moment of foreshadowing, because obviously a professor would not physically harm a student in this way. You get this small peek behind the mask of Barty Crouch Jr. impersonating Moody. The film basically treats it as a comedic moment, and you have to wonder if this is just a moment where either the directors didn't read the book or just totally misinterpreted what this scene was showing. Because this is, I believe, less about Draco in a lot of ways and more about Barty Crouch Jr. being mad at Lucius Malfoy and punishing Lucius Malfoy for abandoning Voldemort. I might be wrong there, but it's more than just about Draco in this moment. And the movies don't give you that inclination in any way. Speaking of, foreshadowing is pretty much non-existent in the movies. And I know film versus book, like, you have limitations on how you could foreshadow something in a film. It's just not that long to begin with. Books have more time to weave this foreshadowing in. But even still, I think this is just a critique on the medium itself, and that it's very hard to adapt something that takes place over hundreds of pages into 2 hours of runtime. I think they did manage to include a little bit of the foreshadowing. There's this scene where Harry goes into Moody's / Barty Crouch Jr.'s office, and Moody's talking about a faux glass, which is supposed to show when your foes are present, and it shows Moody's face getting all weird and double and whatever, and then the real Moody yells and bangs on the chest, which is something that does not happen in the books at all, because if I were Harry, I would certainly ask somebody about why Professor Moody has a human in a chest, and that might be cause for some concern by Dumbledore or Snape or anybody that, might want to check on something like that. But ultimately, this winds us up at the reveal itself. This does have a minor change from the film to the book. In the film, Barty Crouch Jr. just sort of goes on this long soliloquy and reveals everything to Harry without any prompting. He is so sort of enraged by the fact that some of the Death Eaters have betrayed Voldemort and haven't been punished for it. Like, he just gives it all away on his own. In the movies, he basically messes up. He asks about the graveyard, and Harry's like, I never said anything about the graveyard. And so Harry catches him in a little trap. And I don't know exactly what to think about it, because you lose this moment, moment of gloating from Barty Crouch Jr. versus Barty Crouch Jr. was still going to pretend to be Moody for the foreseeable future, apparently, in the films, because why would he care about keeping it a secret at that point? I'm probably nitpicking a little bit too much on this one at a certain point, but even still, it's a strange little change to make because they had to intentionally make these changes. So I don't know. I'd love to be inside their minds of the directors when they're making these changes, because to me, I don't know why you would do something like this. I think overall, the development of Barty Crouch Jr.'s character and the ultimate reveal of the impersonation is obviously way less satisfying in the movies than it is in the books. But I think you're also missing the overall cruelty of Barty Crouch Jr.'s character. He is on the same level, I believe, as Bellatrix is when it comes to being cruel. So you really are missing a lot of that in the movie. And so with that combined, even said, I don't think he's that bad. So I'm going to stick him with a 2 out of 5. Something's missing from the character, but I, again, don't think it's that bad. Fred and George. This is one segment where I'm here to tell you that I think the films mostly got it right, and I'm saying it right up front. I think the main issue with Fred and George is really just their lack of screen time. For instance, Ludo Bagman is cut from the movie entirely, and that means that anyone that had a scene with Ludo Bagman is also removed, and that scene is gone. So the twins don't have their normal scene at the Quidditch World Cup where they're betting their life savings and getting scammed and making an absurdly specific call based on Crumb catching the snitch and losing. We don't have any of that. And it's not so important that we're missing that betting scene as it is that we're missing the sort of setup for how they afford their wizard joke shop to begin with. There's no ultimate payoff for Harry giving them the winnings at the end if they didn't get scammed out of them at the beginning. So it's a small thing, but ultimately I'm not too mad about it because I understand wanting to cut down on some of the characters here, but it's a small thing. Second, their exit from Hogwarts. We obviously still see it. They still light fireworks off everywhere and they, give Umbridge a scare and everything. But in the movies, that's kind of it. In the books, it's this full production. They have these portable swamps that fill the hallways, and it's this orchestrated event. They give Peeves instructions at the end to give him hell, and Peeves salutes them at the very end. It's this incredibly coordinated extreme moment that just doesn't get as much attention as I wish it did, because it feels like it could be a moment that could be really blown out of proportion in the visual version of this. And so it is one moment that, again, once we get there in the TV show, I hope that it's a fuller example of the Weasleys' pranks. I mean, this is something that had effects for 2 weeks afterwards. The kids are running around playing pranks on everyone in the castle. And yet, in the movie, it's just kind of one scene where they light some fireworks off and fly away, and that's that. So I just wish that we got more of this, honestly. And the last thing I have to mention, of course, is Fred's death. This is probably the most egregious part of their section. It's, in the books, a very emotional moment. Fred is battling alongside Percy. Percy is like joking for the first time that Fred remembers in any recent history, and then something explodes, and then Fred is dead. And we see it all happen. In the movies, it's just something that like Harry walks past and just sees Fred on the ground, and it's like not even talked about. It's kind of crazy that he gets no on-screen death, honestly. I mean, not to mention the fact that Percy's like basically not present. I mean, we barely even get Fred and George, so I understand that it's reasonable for Percy to be basically entirely absent, but even still, I feel like one of these main twins deserved an on-screen death at this point. So ultimately, I think at the end of this, their characters are basically pretty loyal to the books. They're chaotic, they're funny, they're entertaining, they're entrepreneurial. I really just wish that I had more of it. I think I have to give Fred and George a 1 out of 5. I think they're probably one of the more faithful adaptations from the book to the movie. Maybe that's just because we don't see them all that much. There's not that much opportunity for it to go wrong, but I guess I'm really just here to say I want more Fred and George in the future, and fingers crossed the TV show does that. Hagrid. So I think Hagrid's kind of a mixed bag. Book Hagrid is like a warm, loyal friend. Movie Hagrid is like this kind of oafish character that's kind of there just to explain some plot points to some children. All in, I think there's a lot of things that basically just get toned down with Hagrid's character more than anything. For instance, his sort of affinity for deadly creatures, I think, gets toned down quite a bit. I mean, in the books, he has dangerous creatures all the time, and they do cause injuries and damage and cause problems with students. There's these like blast-ended shroots that happen, that there's Grop in the forest, which is way toned down in the movies. Like in the books, Grop could very easily have killed Hermione, Ron, or Harry at any given moment, and it's all just kind of like smoothed out a little bit in the books. In the movies. This is getting hard. I'm an hour and a half into this, and it's getting difficult. I mean, Grop is able to like rip trees out of the ground, so he very obviously could do a lot more damage than is shown on screen. Movie Hagrid is basically limited to like Buckbeak and Aragog the giant spider, which, to be fair, Aragog, definitely a deadly spider. So, he's not totally scot-free from his deadly creature habit, but, I think it's toned down quite a bit in the movies. Secondly, he has this sort of emotional instability problem and alcoholism problem present in the books that isn't quite shown in the movies, at least not to the same degree. I mean, in the books, like, there's multiple times where Hagrid's like completely drunk. Obviously, the very beginning, he gets drunk with Quirrell and like spoils how to get past Fluffy and all of that stuff. Past that, he responds in ways that are much more extreme across a bunch of different scenarios. I mean, many times for good reason. I mean, he did get sent to Azkaban. He's definitely scarred by that. He goes into a somewhat deep depression following that. He also reacts to things that go against him in much louder, more ferocious ways. I mean, when you think about him being sent to Azkaban, his reaction to Lucius and Cornelius Fudge when they come into his hut is much louder in the books than it is in the movies. The movies, he basically just kind of like goes along with it. And in the books, he's like ready to fight. This is another weird one when you go back and watch the scene of Hagrid being taken to Azkaban. He, like, first of all, Dumbledore is in there giving, Ron and Harry, who are under the invisibility cloak, this line about like whoever asks for help at Hogwarts shall always be given, whatever. And he just like stares directly at Harry and Ron, and Lucius like turns and looks as well. And it's like so like over the top obvious that just weird direction for the actor there, I think. And then it's immediately followed up by Hagrid being like, follow the spiders in the most insane way possible, which he, to be fair, kind of does in the books as well, but like the whole sequence is just ridiculous. It's it is, book 2 and whatever, so it's definitely for kids, but like, I don't know, it's beyond me. All in, I don't think any changes with Hagrid are really all that drastic. He's a little bit less dangerous and a little bit less emotional in the books. Sorry, that's reversed. He's a little bit less dangerous and a little bit less emotional in the movies compared to the books, but otherwise it just kind of makes him a little bit less bombastic. I think he's another example of an actor, Robbie Coltrane, that is going to like go down as Hagrid forever, which makes me a little bit uncertain about what the TV show is going to do, because I forget Shaun of the Dead guy's name, but like he looks just like Hagrid. I don't know what the intention is there, but like he is just very clearly cosplaying as Robbie Coltrane, who's cosplaying as Hagrid. So I don't know exactly what the intention is there. That'll be a character. We'll have to see how it goes, but fingers crossed, knock on wood. I don't know. All in, I'm giving Hagrid a 2 out of 5. There's some noticeable differences, but I really think the damage is not that great. Okay, I think that does it. That's like 15 characters ranked from their books to their movie adaptations from 1 to 5. You guys gotta let me know how I did on this, who I missed. I'm sure I missed a character that you wanted me to do, but some of these didn't have all that much content. And honestly, if the character was removed from the movie, I can't do a whole section about a character that doesn't exist in the movie. So sorry, there's no section on peeves. Anyway, if you're liking the content, again, press the like button, press the subscribe button, leave a comment down below. I've got videos that I've made about ranking spells and ranking characters and finding the plot holes in different videos. There's so much content on this channel that you'll find something you like, I guarantee it. If you want to support the channel, I have a Patreon that posts all these videos completely ad-free. I have started posting these videos on Spotify, so you can find me there. I also have memberships available on the channel if you want to support directly on YouTube. You get access to the videos a few days early, and it helps me make more content for you. And with that, I think I'm all out of things to say. So thanks again for watching. I'll see you next time.